was and is a myth surrounding the founding of the United States of America. Although I'm happy to say, since my book was published a few years ago, a couple of other books have emerged that, not going as far as my book, begin to unmask the founding of the United States of America. And that's a very positive sign. And you are correct in your presumption, sadly and tragically, that until the publication of my book, there really hadn't been the kind of searching critical examination of the founding. Now, of course, many historians had sort of gone up to the precipice and gone up to the verge of unmasking, but then they sort of looked down into the precipice and then walked back. I won't mention their names because it may not reflect well upon them. But in a nutshell, the United States was founded not least because the European settlers in this settler colony revolted because they thought Britain was moving towards the abolition of slavery per Somerset's case in June 1772 in London, a case that abolished enslavement of Africans in England. They had good reason to believe that that case would cross the Atlantic, thereby jeopardizing fortunes, not to mention jeopardizing the ongoing project of seizing the land of the Native American population. And rather than undergo that prospect, they revolted and kicked out the British. They went on to, of course, oust the British from the leadership of the African slave trade. That had taken place, I would say, by the late 18th century, that is to say, a mere few decades after 1776. And as I've said in subsequent books, for example, my book on Cuba, I pointed out that as early as the 1790s, the United States was in charge of bringing Africans to Cuba. As I said in my book on Brazil, as early as the late 1830s, the United States was involved in the leadership of bringing Africans to Brazil, which now has the largest black population outside of Nigeria. And correspondingly, as Britain was ousted from this lucrative market, it, of course, turned on both slavery and the slave trade, abolishing the slave trade by 1807, well before the United States, and then, of course, abolishing slavery in Barbados, Jamaica, etc., 1833, 1834. And it's very difficult to imagine how a state like the United States, which was in the leadership of foisting manacles and chains upon Africans, not only in North America, but in Cuba and Brazil, somehow has been Christian as embodying a great leap forward for humanity. I mean, this is mind-boggling that this myth has persisted for so long. And certainly, I think the myth has been very corrosive on the politics and consciousness of the African population in North America, because when they have been rebelling since 1776, in many ways they were told that they were rebelling against this great leap forward for humanity. It's almost like they were reactionary by seeking to break the chains of slavery. And it becomes very difficult to even understand what's happening today with the election of Donald J. Trump, unless one understands this history, unless one understands the fact that the United States was a settler colony. Interestingly enough, settler colony is a term that's generally absent from the political vocabularies, even of people who consider themselves to be radical, which also helps to explain why the United States had difficulty in confronting other settler colonies, such as apartheid South Africa, for example, such as Rhodesia, the predecessor outlaw state to Zimbabwe. And it also helps to shed light on other settler revolts, not unlike the settler revolt in 1776. For example, the settler revolt in Rhodesia, 1965, where the Europeans were seeking to forestall the onset of decolonization of that nation, that is to say, one person, one vote, which would have meant African majority rule, or the settler revolt in Algeria in the 1950s, where the settlers were seeking to forestall the arrival of decolonization and one person, one vote. And even if one looks at states that did not have a revolt but were under British rule, I mean, for example, Canada. We all know about following the North Star to Canada. That's what the Africans did in trying to escape the oppression and persecution in North America. Now, it's rather strange indeed that the so-called revolutionary republic, the United States of America, people were trying to escape it and go to this British colony that was Canada that did not revolt against British rule. I mean, this kind of mental acrobatics, that the failure to honestly confront the history of this country has been very corrosive, not only, I would say, to the black population, but also to the so-called white population as well, which has not been forced to confront its history. And in fact, it helps to shed light on this distinction between the liberals and conservatives, which is the dominant paradigm in the United States of America. I don't know if you've seen the new film Get Out.
No, I haven't seen it as of yet.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, it's a science fiction film in a sense, a social thriller is what the filmmaker calls it. And it basically is an attack on liberal mythology. And through the lens of showing racism. And I think, just to step back for a second and connect this to our discussion this evening, I think that increasingly, particularly with the election of Donald J. Trump, many in our community are beginning to question not only conservative mythology, which of course we have little trouble unmasking, but also we're beginning to confront liberal mythology, which has gone along with the myth of 1776 to our detriment. The only question is, where do we go from here?
Professor Horne, you and I'm going to pass the mic to Brother Richard. You talked, I saw a Democracy Now! Interview that you did, and I want you to expound on this for our listening audience. You mentioned to the host, to understand the events of 1776, you must understand what took place in 1688. Mm-hmm. Talk about those events leading up to 1776 for our listening audience.
Well, fortunately, by the end of the year, I'll have a new book out called The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in North America and the Caribbean, which sheds further light on 1688. But in the book we're discussing this evening, what I basically say is that there was a so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, where the monarchy took a step back and the rising merchant class took a step forward. This was particularly true for the African slave trade, which theretofore had been under the thumb of the king through the organizing of the Royal African Company in 1672. Now, the organizing of the Royal African Company in 1672 represented a giant leap backwards for African people in particular, but 1688 in many ways dwarfs 1672 because you had a deregulation of the African slave trade. In other words, not only was the monarch involved in enslaving Africans, but scores of merchants, as the project of free trade in Africans was unleashed. And these merchants descended upon the African continent with the maniacal and crazed energy of diabolical bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly, I would say, to Jamaica and Barbados in the first instance. But what happened, as so often happens, is that these merchants overreached. They had dragged so many Africans across the Atlantic to these sugar islands because they were producing sugar, which was not only used to sweeten tea, but was also seen as a kind of miracle drug and also as a sign of status to use sugar, believe it or not, even though today it's seen in the opposite manner. But by dragging so many Africans across the Atlantic, they created favorable conditions for slave revolts, which proceeded, which then led to a great trek of European settlers from the Caribbean to North America, where the European settlers thought they could escape slave revolts. But, of course, they could not and did not because, of course, there was a major slave revolt in New York City in 1712 and South Carolina, and perhaps the bloodiest of them all, in 1739, and New York City again in 1741. And what happened, to characterize what characterizes these slave revolts is the fact that the Africans oftentimes were collaborating with the enemies of the settlers. That's been one of the hallmarks of our existence in North America. That is to say, we find out who the chief enemy of the settler class is, and then we work with them to undermine the settlers. Interestingly enough, I should say parenthetically, since in the last 60 years with the agonized retreat of so-called legalized Jim Crow or U.S. apartheid and a kind of citizenship, that particular strategy has gathered dust, although with the election of Donald J. Trump, which might represent a new moment, you may see a resuscitation and revival of that strategy. But in any case, you saw that the Africans in South Carolina in 1739 were collaborating with the Spanish in Florida. Many of these Africans in South Carolina were Angolans. Angola, as you know, had been confronted, if not colonized, by the Portuguese since the late 15th century, the 1490s. Many of these Africans spoke Portuguese, which is quite similar to Spanish. Many of them had been converted, oftentimes forcibly, to the Roman Catholic faith, which was also the faith of the Spanish in Florida. And so they both joined together and tried to overthrow the English and other British settlers in South Carolina. And likewise, yes?
Dr. Horne, question. And then, because I'm going to ask this one more thing, I'm going to pass it to Brother Richard. You talked about the deregulation that happened in 1688. And it sounds like you're describing the origin of infightings between European nations over our ancestors. So before the deregulation, how was this crime against humanity, this slave trade, conducted? Was it one person in charge and they allocated different European nations to deal with different areas of the mother continent before the deregulation, when you stated that just willy-nilly Europeans just ran over there, just maniacally handcuffing and taking our ancestors off the shore? How was it handled before the deregulation?
Well, you need to understand that the Spanish had a first mover's advantage with regard to the slave trade.
Okay.
Of course, going back to 1492 and the journey of Christopher Columbus, which we all know about. But, of course, the Spanish were also heavily involved in enslaving indigenous populations. You'll find the indigenous population of the Americas, you'll find their DNA all over the world because they were enslaving and depopulating the Americas by enslaving the indigenous population, then shipping them out to the four corners of the world, and then bringing Africans into, say, Jamaica, for example. But it wasn't just the Spanish. The French were involved. The Dutch were huge players before the end of the 1600s. The Danish were involved. Swedes were involved. It was really a festival and a carnival for Europeans generally. But with the formation of the Royal African Company in 1672, you saw that England, which was something of a non-entity as late as the late 1500s, then began to surge to the forefront. Now, England surged to the forefront. A number of deliberate steps take place. One, the taking of Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655. Then the taking of what are now the Middle Atlantic states of the United States, including Pennsylvania, by the way, in 1662, 1663, 1664. And then that opens up more territory to oust the indigenous and bring in more Africans, which leads to the formation of the Royal African Company in 1672. But what's happening, as you can readily envision, is that the monarchy is creating conditions for its own retreat, because by opening up land and bringing in more Africans, you're bringing in more settlers who are getting enriched, and they begin to oppose this idea of the monarchy monopolizing this lucrative fortune in enslaved Africans and stolen land. And that leads to the push in 1688, which, by the way, there's a new book called Freedom's Debt from the University of North Carolina Press, which makes the point that the empowering of Parliament, which is oftentimes seen as this great leap forward for democracy, that the empowerment of Parliament in England has a lot to do with trying to strip the powers of the king to monopolize the African slave trade. Therefore, freedom's debt, freedom being this so-called democracy, owes a debt to Africa and Africans. And then, as noted, with 1688, you see this expansion, this explosion in terms of the manacling and handcuffing of Africans, which provides wealth that leads to the rise of capitalism because, of course, the African slave trade involves building ships. It involves insurance policies because the Africans had this tendency to revolt, and you had to insure against that prospect. It involved the rise of banking because these voyages had to be financed. And therein, you begin to see the rise of the system called capitalism, in which we are still enmeshed. But what's interesting about that is that even though our ancestors basically provided the fuel for the rise of this system called capitalism, there are not that many in our community who connect those dots and go in and make a critique of capitalism. I mean, that's ironic indeed, shall we say.
Brother Richard.
Well, oh man, Dr. Horne, I really appreciate your work, and I'm glad that you opened that up, because that was one of my things I am fascinated about your work, because you make the origin of the European economic system, what they call now the global system. And I think it was I heard Martin, financial commentator for the Financial Times, called when they had the crisis in '08. He said the Anglo-Saxon system was in crisis, which it's the first for me. It was the first time hearing them codify in recent history in a commercial press that this is an Anglo-Saxon system that has global connection, and it seems that your work kind of focuses on developing that premise, that it is them, France, Germany, Spain, Britain, and then the colonial American, or as you say, colonial settlers, those merchants, freeing themselves up to be in this trade, which is like really powerful. And one thing trying to stay in what you were raising, I was looking at that petition that was in 1696, which gave them making the argument of the traders to be able to engage more in the trade, which opened, as you said, that floodgate of these individual individual traders, merchants, actually making more money by transporting Africans. You've developed it, but can you take us through that period of them traders? Because I did also read Freedom's Debt, and they kind of, with the point that you made, it was really important as far as what we even talk about now when they talk about free trade, because it seems that's a continuation of then.
Well, first of all, with regard to your prior point, I think you were referring to Martin Wolf of the Financial Times of London. And by the way, in terms of these leading bourgeois newspapers, the capitalist newspapers, I would put the Financial Times above the New York Times, certainly above the Wall Street Journal, which is almost a parody of a bourgeois newspaper nowadays. Because, number one, the Financial Times is written explicitly for the investor class in the North Atlantic community, whereas the New York Times, of course, is written for a broader audience. And as a result, if you're going to make investments, you really have to have an idea of what's going on. You can't afford to believe in the alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway, the Bush advisor, might put it. And so I think you'll find a much more comprehensive view of the capitalist economy in the Financial Times. Likewise, I think with regard to this so-called Anglo-American system, which is the rightward edge of capitalism, we're going to have to pay very close attention to what's happening this year, because June 2016, we had Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. which has really, of course, fueled Donald J. Trump, but has upset a goodly number of the capitalist class on both sides of the Atlantic. Although we have to pay careful and close attention to how Trump might try to capitalize on this by seeking to forge a so-called Anglo-American alliance, not only against the usual suspects, the Africans, people in Latin America, the Asians, et cetera, but also against the European Union, against Germany and France. I mean, I hope you paid attention to the rather frosty, chilling meeting between Chancellor Merkel this past 24 to 48 hours and Donald J. Trump, because that's what the Germans are expecting. And then, of course, you had the election of Donald J. Trump in November 2016. And then just a few days ago, you had the election of the Netherlands, which, as I said, was an early leader in the African slave trade. As a matter of fact, if you had talked to people in 1620 as to who might be the global superpower in 2017, they might have said Holland, certainly not England. But, of course, Holland has been in decline for 300 years, which it might be comforting for people in the United States who are worried about U.S. decline, because Holland's been in decline for 300 years, but in some places it's still a rather pleasant place to live. That's comforting, I'm sure, to those who have all their money invested in this country. But in any case, you notice that in Holland, the right-wing populist, Geert Wilders, the Donald J. Trump of the Netherlands, they did not prevail. Now we're going to have to watch the French elections in a few weeks, April 23rd, and see if Marine Le Pen, the leader of the neo-fascists, whether or not she prevails. And then we have to watch the German elections a few months after that to see if the neo-fascists prevail there, which I doubt. Then if that plans out, what that'll tell us is that the right-wing populist surge is basically an Anglo-American right-wing populist surge, which then raises the possibility of a global front against the Anglo-American alliance. Now, there's some other, excuse me for going on about what's happening today, but
oh, that's good.
I've been looking for somebody to tell this to.
And we've been waiting for someone to tell us, too.
Okay. Then, of course, with the election of Donald J. Trump and all this blather about Russia, and then we could go into that in more detail, but it seemed as if Donald J. Trump wanted to flip the script, and just like Nixon had gone to China in the early 1970s and was able to woo China into an anti-Moscow alliance that led directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union by 1991, now it seemed, per Trump, that the Yankees were going to try to woo Moscow and then enlist them against China. Now, that's what I was thinking in November 2016. And by the way, even though I think the liberals have gone overboard in trying to act as if Putin won the election for Trump, I do think there needs to be an investigation of the relationship nonetheless, although we're going to have to walk a tightrope because the investigation of the relationship should not lead to a new Cold War, which would not be in our interest. But in any case, you might recall that just after his election, Trump reached out to the leader of Taiwan, which China sees as a rebel province, and he said that this was negotiable, this whole idea of Taiwan. President Xi Jinping refused to talk to Trump, and then in mid-February 2017, Trump backed down. Perhaps somebody told him that the United States government stays afloat by borrowing money from China. And now you see Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State in China, just today, shaking hands in a grip and grin with President Xi, actually quoting language about win-win that's from the Chinese playbook. President Xi invited to Mar-a-Lago in Florida to be wooed by China, to try to woo China. And so now I'm trying to puzzle this out. Okay, so I thought he was going to try to – so I can't decide if Trump is simply incoherent, or is there some sort of method in this madness, or is it that he's going to try to neutralize both Russia and China so he can go after the rest of the world? Because usually when U.S. imperialism goes after countries, Russia or China try to check them. But if he neutralizes them both, then perhaps he can go after the rest of the world and then go get momentum to the point where he can then go after Russia and China. At least that's what I was thinking. everything's in a state of flux right now. So I
was thinking that the connection between Trump and Russia was because of the oil pipeline that Russia has that goes through the western part of Europe, and the tie that Europe or even the European Union is dealing with, that they don't want to disrupt Russia because they do want that oil to come through as a byproduct, and the relationship between Russia and China. But it would also move everyone out of the Middle East because of the tension that I think that has escalated to the point at this point, especially when they're saying these are non-state actors. But the other side with North America was with this fracking and the whole idea that these Exxon and them can be able to put a cheaper oil on the market and sell to Europe. It might balance out if a Trump and Russia would be able to make some kind of deal so that to put in check these, because of the tension, the environmentalist tension, and maybe the populist tension about really going whole hog, if that's a phrase, to pull this oil out, this fracking this oil, because people are do have some resistance, and the more they do, the more water they'll see that is getting polluted by this fracking. But with Russia, it's already a given that they can be able to move that oil through. Is that the Baltic area, I believe, that had been talked about, even along with, I remember Brzezinski raising this point when he did the grand chessboard, that area was an area of concern in relationship to either NATO getting control or the fear, and how Russia could be able to move and create connections. And Europe has already, England, France, they have already said they don't want any destabilization on that side because they could use that oil instead of shipping back and forth with Saudi Arabia. So my thinking was, and it's not developed, but just that Trump seems to be the best guy to put forward to raise his hand to change the Cold War kind of paradigm that has been going on around Russia, to say, well, we can do business, and that will fall right within his framework. That was undeveloped. That's my thinking.
Yeah, I understand, and certainly the energy market is in a state of flux too. I'm speaking to you from the place that calls itself the Petro Metro, that is to say Houston, where the economy is heavily dependent upon keeping close tabs on petroleum. And, of course, there are meetings here all the time, international meetings, just one a week or so ago, involving oil lords and captains from all over the world. And certainly there's a real concern right now about the continuing fall in the price of a barrel of oil, which is jeopardizing budgets, not only in Russia, not only in Texas, but also in Nigeria and Angola as well. Keep in mind that ExxonMobil has a stranglehold over the oil of Equatorial Guinea, by the way, which is a major producer. And, of course, that relationship has helped to keep in power the Obiang family since 1979, by the way. And, of course, the sons of Teodoro Obiang, of course, are living large all over the world, including having property, at least recently, in Malibu, just outside of the city of Los Angeles. Also, ExxonMobil has invested heavily in natural gas, particularly in Mozambique. As you know, the Mozambicans have been softened up over the years after fighting a heroic liberation struggle and insurgent independence in 1975 over Portuguese colonialism backed by the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But then about 10 years later, the founding father, Samora Machel, was assassinated by the apartheid authorities. His plane was driven into a mountain intentionally. You may recall that his widow wound up marrying Nelson Mandela some years after that. And now, of course, major natural gas discoveries have been made off the coast of Mozambique. Exxon has invested heavily. So, and Rex Tillerson, former ExxonMobil CEO, is now Secretary of State. So obviously we're going to have to watch Africa policy like a hawk under this new Trump team. But certainly I think we need a closer and more careful scrutiny of oil politics when it comes to trying to figure out what this Trump team is up to, not only because of what you said, the relationship with Russia, but also, of course, because of his selection of Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And also, you know, I mean, as I said, I think the liberals have gone overboard in terms of trying to blame the election of Trump on Putin. I mean, look, the black community was subjected to fake news from Eastern Europe. Not all of that fake news was coming from Moscow. Some of it was coming from Macedonia, by the way. But, you know, the liberals tend to ignore that because that doesn't fit into the larger narrative. But, you know, the black community was subjected to fake news, and we voted against Trump 9-1. So just to say that, you know, hacking from Russia and all that led to Trump, I think is a bridge too far. And it evades the responsibility of doing an analysis of voter suppression of the black community in Milwaukee, for example. It's really stunning, the kind of nonfeasance and malfeasance that these liberals have gone through, which once again underlines the importance of the film Get Out. But I guess you want me to get back to the African slave trade.
But let me say something in reference to that, Dr. Horne, because you did draw a parallel to show us that the mindset basically of Europeans to crave more riches and to continuously develop capitalism haven't really changed. And it also tells us that we as a people need to do better as far as knowing our history and knowing what we need to do. The reason I'm saying is because what I want you to talk about is the role of black resistance to 1776. You know, you touched on the 1712 Manhattan Revolt, which happened in the North up here in New York, and the Stoner Rebellion, which happened in South Carolina. But you mentioned in a Democracy Now!, I think, piece, or the C-SPAN piece, that the settlers believed that the French was supplying our ancestors with weapons in the northern revolts, and that the Spanish was supplying our ancestors with weapons in the southern revolts. And I just want you to go into some of those revolts, because some of our people, they don't realize the level of revolts here in this country and outside of the country, because it's not really talked about. You know, the ones that Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, and Denmark Vesey, but others our people don't really know about because that information is suppressed all the time. Our people weren't watching a tennis match, watching this country develop and just sitting on their hands. Our people were trying to free themselves. So talk about our role of resistance leading up to 1776.
Well, I would not only say resistance was a major force pre-1776 and following 1776. I would also go, I can't remember if I said this explicitly in that book in 1776, but this is, if I were to writing it today, this is what I would write. And I may have written it then, too. But basically, there was a struggle for the control of North America amongst various forces. These forces included European powers, such as London, Madrid, and Paris. These forces included the settlers, mostly British settlers, who wound up triumphant. And these forces included Native Americans and Africans. Now, the Native Americans and Africans were oftentimes allied, and they would oftentimes ally with these European powers at various stages to try to advance their agenda. And that is why I have a complete chapter in the 1776 book talking about resistance, including arson, poisoning, slave revolts, murders. Matter of fact, the arson was so significant that ultimately I would say that if someone were to do a history of fire departments, just like if you were to do a history of urban police departments, you have to connect it in North America to the slave factor. With regard to poisonings, I recall in that 1776 book having a paragraph about Georgia in particular, where the poisoning was so systematic that it's easy to infer that there was this phenomenon which we might call ethnobotanists amongst the Africans who had uncovered secrets of poisonous plants and were promiscuously using them against the settlers. Now, this was, of course, not unique to North America, as in fact, the Americas generally were inflamed, and there was a struggle, not unlike the struggle in North America, as to who would prevail. Now, we know, for example, in the 1750s, that in what is now Haiti, there was a mass plot of the Africans to poison the settlers that was barely defeated. We also know that by 1791, with the onset of the Haitian Revolution, you saw a breach in the wall of slavery, particularly the triumph of the Haitian Revolution in 1804. And you know I have this book on the Haitian Revolution, Confronting Black Jacobins, where I put forward the argument that the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, represented a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with that slave system's collapse. More specifically, with the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, we were able to flip Britain and get Britain a few years later to abolish the slave trade, and then it was worried about its investments in Jamaica and Barbados to move to abolish slavery to get out while the getting was good, whereas the Yankees, of course, dug in their heels and therefore had to be forced into a bloody civil war, 1861 to 1865. But in other words, the Haitian Revolution, I would say, was the key factor in helping to explain why and where we are today and where we were able to escape enslavement, which is why we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to our brothers and sisters in Haiti that can never and will never be repaid. And that's a kind of interpretation that I think we need to focus on as this 21st century unfolds.
You talked about the Manhattan Slave Revolt and also Stono, but talk about Lord Dunmore. I think he was a governor in Virginia at the time, and his relationship with some of our enslaved ancestors. It was a strange relationship. Talk about that.
Well, Lord Dunmore, briefly, in 1775, when the settlers were brewing their revolt, he offered to free Africans.
Now, wait a minute. Before you talk about that, was Lord Dunmore one of the settlers, or he was a...
He was the colonial governor of Virginia.
Okay.
The last colonial governor of Virginia, by the way. And as the Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington and all these slave owners were cooking up their revolt, he was trying to outfox them by offering to free their most valued property to repel against them. So, of course, he's considered a bad guy with regard to the settlers. But what's interesting, in writing this book that'll be out later this year that I've already mentioned, that tactic of the Europeans seeking to ally with the Africans in order, and both of course, the Africans have their agendas, the Europeans have their agenda. Oftentimes the agendas dovetail. So in 1655, when the English were trying to overthrow the Spanish in Jamaica, and of course they did successfully, the Spanish freed Africans, anticipating Lord Dunmore, in the hopes that the Africans would help the Spanish repel the English. And of course, what happened is that from that point forward, the Africans in Jamaica were sort of an independent third force, if you like, not allied with the victorious Londoners, not allied with the settlers, but of course, as Maroons, they were battering the settlers from time to time, et cetera. And then that, even if you go back to the late 1500s, when the Queen's pirate, Sir Francis Drake, sailed into what is now Panama and was seeking to loot and plunder the Spanish there, he was trying to entice the Seminoles, or the Maroons, the Africans there, to ally with London. And of course, the Seminoles had a bone to pick with Spain, who they were familiar with, and so they were not necessarily hostile to what Sir Francis Drake was putting down. And then skip ahead a few centuries to 1863, Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, that was basically, I'm giving a test to my Introduction to African American Studies. I hope none of them are listening, because I'm about to tell one of the questions. One of the questions I'm going to ask is, why was the Emancipation Proclamation seen as a militarily expedient maneuver, more so than a humanitarian gesture? Because to that point, Lincoln's government was getting battered from pillar to post by the Confederates, who thought, not incorrectly, that they were more in tune with the founding and George Washington and the slaveholders than these whippersnappers like Abraham Lincoln. And so, particularly after Antietam in the fall of 1862, Lincoln needed more troops. And so he freed the Africans under the jurisdiction of the so-called Confederate States of America, and of course, sort of overlooked the Africans who were enslaved under his jurisdiction. And that proved to be the turning point in the war. And so the point that you should glean from this little journey through history is how the Africans, of course, oftentimes were trying to exercise self-determination, that the Africans which oftentimes had their own agenda, and oftentimes this agenda did not coincide with the agenda of the settlers, and that the Africans were not adverse to allying with foreign powers from time to time to try to crush the settlers. And this particular tendency continued on to the 20th century until finally the United States government decided to engage in this agonized retreat from legalized apartheid. But therein you begin to see the seeds of the Trump victory, because at the same time they were engaged in this agonized retreat from legalized apartheid, they were repressing working class organizations like unions, leading to this canard that the reactionary forces could put forward in 2016, that in the United States, they only care about black people, believe it or not. And the working class, which of course is constructed as white, the fact that we're working class somehow gets lost in the mix, that they're not concerned about the white working class. And that, of course, helped to bring Trump to power, and is one of the most potent propaganda maneuvers we'll have to fight in 2017.
Go ahead, Richard, because I'm going to take a break in about 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. Doesn't that fit in when you raise the point in your book about the Scott-Irish being brought in at different times because of labor and the discussion around that, but their allegiance, even in spite of the finance and merchant class, regardless of it being even, what was the term used today, at their own detriment. It seems that it's still a historical continuity when you look at the working class working against their own self-interest, and then even at that time, those ethnic Europeans who were brought in as laborers, but then thought that they were too expensive, or at times because of war in Europe, they wasn't as plentiful or readily, and Africans were brought in, that they still were working against their own self-interest.
Well, the working class, defined as white, oftentimes has felt that it has more to gain from a race alliance with the ruling elite than from a class alliance with working class people of color. And actually, if you look at the expropriation of the Native Americans, particularly in Georgia under Andrew Jackson, who, of course, is Trump's hero. He has his portrait in the Oval Office. He visited, I think he visited Andrew Jackson's grave in Tennessee when he was in Nashville the other day, or he'll be visiting it soon. And so they expropriate the Cherokees, even though many of the Cherokees were willing to go along with the program. They were willing to enslave Africans. They were willing to don so-called European dress and finery. But that didn't save them. they were still expelled, and their land was given out to many poor, white, so-called white working class people. And then the Homestead Act in the 1860s, as the Civil War is unfolding. The U.S. government is expropriating Native Americans, handing the land out to poor Europeans, because whiteness and white supremacy was an organizing principle. And so the so-called white working class had reason to believe that they had more to gain from an alliance with the ruling elite than with people in their own class. However, unfortunately, I don't think they paid attention to events over the last 60 to 70 years. That is to say, with the changing correlation of forces globally, it's become very difficult for U.S. imperialism to move forward the way it did, say, up to 1945, for example, or even up to 1955, for example. And it's unclear to me if this white working class is going to be able to benefit the way they benefited in the 19th century, but we'll see. I mean, I don't think that's going to work out, but, I've been wrong before. We'll see. And in any case, I know you have to take a break, and also I have to get along pretty soon. Yeah.
Now I know that we engaged you for an hour. Do you have maybe 10 more minutes, Professor Horne?
10 more minutes is fine.
Great. Well, in fact, maybe we'll hold the break, and we'll take it after you have to leave us. Professor Horne, you talked about Richard raised the question about poor Europeans coming over here, which basically the settlers were. You had Europeans here, the settlers. You had other European forces that were involved in other countries or lands of our diaspora. But it seems to me that the Europeans, because on Europe's home continent, it was always fighting going on, some of it behind religion. But it seems to me, now you correct me if I'm wrong, that they tabled a lot of these factions and fightings to kind of focus their attention on our ancestors, where they would have a unified front in dealing with our ancestors. Am I wrong, or did they talk about that?
Well, there's something to what you say. In the book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, which will be out later this year, that's one of the points that I make, that you have the 30 Years' War in Europe, which is gripping the continent, leading to massive depopulation of the European continent, basically coming to a close circa 1648. And coincidentally enough, by 1648, you see settler colonialism well underway, particularly in Virginia and Massachusetts. And with the depopulation of Europe, there becomes this felt need to repopulate or to populate the Americas, particularly if they're shipping out all the Native Americans, with Africans. And then that leads to the so-called Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which, as you know, is still sort of a charter, if you like, for state sovereignty, where the Europeans basically decide to bury the hatchet, if I can use the North American phrase, although, of course, it doesn't work out very well because there's continuing wars in the 17th century, not least between London and the Dutch, the English and the Dutch. But in any case, there leads to a formal settlement that's oftentimes ignored. But I think the best example of what you're talking about probably is the formation of the United Kingdom. Recall that in 1707, you have the Act of Union, where Scotland officially enters the United Kingdom. Of course, the English and the Scottish have been at each other's throats, and you see that Scotland is voting to have another referendum next year to withdraw from the United Kingdom, which will probably prevail because they don't want to leave the European Union, which England is determined to do. And so with the Act of Union in 1707, in the trade union movement, I used to be the trade union lawyer, it led to what in trade union movement we would call pork chop unity. That is to say, you might have contradictions, but to keep those pork chops flowing, you got to bury those contradictions and antagonisms. And of course, we were the pork chops. And so you see that the Scots played a very heavy role in the rise of the British Empire in the 1700s, not only as settlers, but also as administrators. But then with the demise or the erosion of the British Empire in the 20th century, and of course the low-hanging fruit all being accumulated, you then see the Scottish saying, you know what, we don't think we're profiting that handsomely from this United Kingdom, so we're pulling out. So there is something to be said about your thesis that this desire to profit off the misery of others has oftentimes led to European unity. In fact, I mean, you're echoing W.E.B. Du Bois in his influential essay, The African Roots of War, written circa 1915, where he talked about World War I, where he said that what was driving it was the fact that Germany was late to the colonial feast. It was now a power. It thought that England was in decline, so it decided that there needed to be reconfiguration. And so, in other words, feasting on Africa in particular was a motive force of war, just like you can say feasting on Africa helps to drive a kind of concord at certain moments between and amongst European powers.
Professor Horne, you after 1776, when the settlers here defeated the British, you mentioned that by 1790, the U.S. at that time had taken control of the slave trade in Cuba, and by 1840 had taken control of the slave trade in Brazil. How did that affect, what effect did that do on our ancestors in the diaspora? Because, and this is basically a question, we have a lot of Africans or blacks of African descent diaspora in Cuba, which is a small island, and in Brazil has more children of African descent than the whole United States. The U.S. taking control after the defeat of Britain, of the slave trade in all these other places, how did that lead to so many of our ancestors in Brazil and Cuba, for example?
Well, it's not only the United States surging into control of the slave trade, but also Texas. Recall that in 1836, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and all these people who are somehow seen as heroes by some.
Okay.
They revolted against Mexico, not least since Mexico in the previous decade had moved towards abolition of slavery, and in fact had a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, 180 years before Barack Obama. So there was this, just like 1861, there was a secession to perpetuate slavery. 1836, Texas had moved to do the same thing. Shortly thereafter, you found the Texas flag off the coast of Africa, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of Cuba. Galveston, Texas, which is now a kind of backwater south of Houston, was a major slave trading depot. By the way, Jack Johnson, the heroic heavyweight boxing champion, was from Galveston, Texas.
Yes.
As was Barry White, by the way, the late crooner. In any case, what happens is that Texas then came under pressure from both Haiti and Britain to mend its slave trading ways. And as a result, by 1845, Texas could not stand the pressure, so it entered the United States of America because it needed backup, as they say in the streets. And they got that backup from the United States of America. And then, of course, Texas seceded with the Confederate States of America in 1861 to try to continue slavery. And in fact, as late as 1860, you had hundreds of Africans from the Congo being smuggled into Galveston to be enslaved, to be slaves. So this obviously had a devastating impact upon the fortunes of Africa. I just wrote a sentence in my Settler's Apocalypse book where it's mostly about the 17th century, but of course I deal with the precursors. And one of the precursors, of course, is the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, who sailed south from Portugal around Africa in the late 1490s. And he's on his way to India because, of course, the riches of Asia is a motive force for both Christopher Columbus and most of these European pirates known as explorers. And he's passing through the Indian Ocean coming back to Portugal in the late 1490s, and he's angry about something, so he just sort of whimsically bombards Mogadishu in Somalia, just on general principles. I mean, this is the kind of outlaw nonsense, murderous, bloodthirsty piracy that characterized this so-called rise of the North Atlantic countries, which, of course, the rise was built upon a towering corpse, a towering mountain of African corpses, not to mention the destruction of Africa, which is something that Walter Rodney, the late Guyanese historian, talked about in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and, of course, how the late Trinidadian scholar and politician Eric Williams talked about in his book, Capitalism and Slavery. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there because I'm already late to my next appointment.
Listen, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor Horne. Brother Richard, I know you want to get him back so you can go down the path of one of our greats, Paul Robeson.
Yes, and also hopefully by that time your book will be out, your new book will be out, and we can be able to explore that also.
The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, in other words.
Yes.
Oh, I should also mention, since we're talking about new books, I have a book coming out also this year on the pro-Tokyo Negroes. Because as I said in my earlier remarks, the Africans in North America were always trying to find foreign allies. And so this book will be about Japan and Afro-Asian solidarity. Then I have a book coming out on the black press. And then I also have a book coming out on aviation, because the Negroes were captivated by the idea of flying, because it was both a way to escape this hellhole and also a way to bomb this hellhole.
Professor Horne, I want to thank you for being with us this evening, and I look forward to you coming back and more discussion.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
We'll be right back after a brief break. We'll be in open forum the rest of the way, so give us a call. There's a couple callers on hold. And, oh boy, let me get this thing queued up. Richard, it was an interesting discussion that we had with Professor Horne. I wanted him to stay a little longer, but he told me that he had about an hour because I saw some stuff that was posted on Facebook that he was at a discussion earlier with, oh boy, how do I always forget his name?
Sound like me now.
I know it. The professor from Princeton, Cornell West.
Cornell West.
Yes, him and Cornell West had an engagement, and I think he's either just coming from it or he has to attend it. So he told me that he had about an hour to share in reference to the book, but his work is a whole litany of work. Based on our ancestors. I'm going to read some of the titles for our listening audience: Confronting the Black Jacobins, the U.S. and the Haitian Revolution, The Origin of Dominican Republic, Race to Revolution, the United States and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, Black Revolutionaries, William Patterson and the Globalization of the African-American Struggle for Freedom, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African-Americans in the British Empire Fight the U.S. Before Emancipation, Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii, W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, and many, many other titles that he has in reference to our struggles here in this country and documents our struggles.